off when fortune turned against me, nor sufficient control to stop when I'd won. At the end of January, I found myself under the necessity of procuring 200 sequins. Madame Manzoni contrived to obtain from another woman the loan of a diamond ring worth 500. I made up my mind to go to Treviso, 15 miles distant from Venice, to pawn the ring at the Monte de Pieti, which there lends money on valuables at the rate of 5%. I got up early one morning and walked to the end of the Canale Reggio, intending to engage a gondola to take me as far as Mestre, where I could take post-horses, reach Treviso in less than 2 hours, pledge my diamond ring, and return to Venice the same evening. As I passed along St. Job's Quay, I saw in a 2-oared gondola a country girl, beautifully dressed. I stopped to look at her. The gondoliers, supposing that I wanted an opportunity of reaching Mestre at a cheap rate, rowed back to the shore. Observing the girl's lovely face, I don't hesitate but jump into the gondola and pay double fare on condition that no more passengers are taken. The gondoliers, highly pleased with my generosity, thank me and call me Excellency. An elderly priest was seated near the girl. Accepting the title as truly belonging to me, he begs my pardon for not having addressed me as such. "I'm not a Venetian nobleman, Reverend Sir, and I have no right to the title of Eccellenza." "Oh," says the lady, "I'm very glad of that. Whenever I find myself near a nobleman, I'm afraid. But I suppose you're still an illustrissimo?" "Not even that, Signora. I'm only an advocate's clerk." "Well, so much the better. My father was a farmer. As I'm an only daughter, I inherited his property after his death, and I'll also inherit my mother's, who's been ill a long time and can't live much longer. Now, I don't suppose that there's much difference between an advocate's clerk and the daughter of a rich farmer. When travelling, one must accept all sorts of companions. Isn't that so, Uncle?" "Yes, my dear Christine," said the priest. "And as proof you see that this gentleman has accepted our company without knowing who or what we are." "But," I said, "do you think I'd have come if I hadn't been attracted by the beauty of your niece?" At these words the good people burst out laughing. "Why are you laughing?" I asked. "I'll tell you," said the priest. "Do you know what she said, sir, when she saw you on the wharf? 'There's a very handsome young man looking at me. He'd not be sorry to be with us.' And when she saw that the gondoliers were putting back for you to embark, she was delighted." While her uncle was speaking, the indignant niece was slapping him on the shoulder. "But lovely Christine," I said, "why shouldn't I hear that you liked my appearance when I'm so glad to tell you how charming I think you?" "Oh, I know Venetians thoroughly now. They've all told me that they were charmed with me, and not one of those I liked ever made a declaration to me." "What sort of declaration did you want?" "There is only one sort for me, sir, one leading to a good marriage in church. Yet we've been in Venice a fortnight, haven't we, Uncle?" "This girl," said the priest, "is a good match. She owns 3,000 crowns. She wishes to marry a Venetian, and I've accompanied her to Venice to give her that chance. A worthy woman gave us hospitality for a fortnight, and presented her in several houses. She met several marriageable young men, but those who pleased her wouldn't hear of marriage, and those who'd have been glad to marry her didn't take her fancy." "But do you imagine, Reverend Sir, that marriages can be made like omelettes? A fortnight in Venice, that's nothing. You ought to live there at least 6 months. A prudent young man wants to know the character of a girl before he marries her, for it's neither money nor beauty which can ensure happiness in married life." The good curate smiled now and then, but I could see that his niece was very near crying. I felt sorry, for she was a charming girl. When the gondola had entered the long canal of Marghera, I asked the clergyman whether he had a carriage to go to Treviso, through which place he had to pass to reach his destination. "I intended to walk," said the worthy gentleman, "for my parish is poor, and I am the same. But I'll try to obtain a place for Christine in some carriage travelling that way." "You'd confer a real kindness on me," I said, "if you'd both accept a seat in my chaise. It holds 4 persons, and there's plenty of room. After landing, I ordered breakfast and told a vetturino to get a very handsome chaise ready while we had our meal, but the curate said that he must first of all go and say his mass. "Very well, Reverend Sir, we will hear it, and you must say it for my intention." I put a silver ducat in his hand. We proceeded towards the church, and I offered my arm to the niece, who, not knowing whether she ought to accept it or not, said, "Do you suppose that I can't walk alone?" "Certainly not. But if I don't give you my arm, people will think me wanting in politeness." "Well, I'll take it. But now that I have your arm, what will people think of me?" "Perhaps that we love each other and that we make a very nice couple." "And if anyone should inform your mistress that we are in love with each other, or even that you have given your arm to a girl?" "I have no mistress, and I shall have none in future, because I couldn't find a girl as pretty as you in all Venice." "I'm very sorry for you, for we can't go to Venice again, and even if we could, how could we remain there for 6 months? You said that 6 months were necessary to know a girl well." "I'd willingly defray all your expenses." "Indeed? Then say so to my uncle, and he'll think it over, for I couldn't go alone." "In 6 months you'd know me as well." "Oh, I know you very well already." "Could you accept a man like me?" "Why not?" "And will you love me?" "Yes, very much. When you're my husband." At that I looked at her in astonishment, and she seemed like a princess in disguise. She had the figure of a nymph, and since the new fashion of wearing a mantle hadn't yet reached her village, I could see the most beautiful breasts. The end of her richly embroidered skirt didn't go lower than her ankles, which allowed me to admire the neat little foot and the lower part of an exquisitely moulded leg. Her firm and easy walk, the natural freedom of all her movements, a charming look which seemed to say, "I am very glad that you think me pretty." Everything, in short, caused the ardent fire of amorous desires to circulate through my veins. I couldn't imagine how such a lovely girl could have spent a fortnight in Venice without finding a man to marry or to deceive her. I was particularly delighted with her simple, artless way of talking, which in the city might have been taken for silliness. Absorbed in my thoughts, and having resolved in my own mind on rendering brilliant homage to her charms, I waited impatiently for the end of the Mass. On our arrival in Treviso, I found no difficulty in persuading the curate to remain for dinner and supper at a small, unfrequented inn, as I took all the expense upon myself. He accepted very willingly, when I added that immediately after supper a carriage would be in readiness to convey him to his destination. I ordered a fire and a good dinner, and the idea struck me that the curate himself might pledge the ring for me, and thus give me the opportunity of a short interview with his niece. I proposed it to him, saying that I couldn't very well go myself, as I didn't wish to be known. He undertook the commission at once, expressing his pleasure at doing something to oblige me. He left us, and I remained alone with Christine. I spent an hour with her, without trying to give her even a kiss, although I was dying to do so. But I prepared her heart to burn with the same desires which were already burning in me by those words which so easily inflame the imagination of a girl. The curate came back and returned me the ring, saying that it could not be pledged until the day after the morrow, in consequence of the festival of the Holy Virgin. He'd spoken to the cashier, who'd said that, if I liked, the bank would lend double the sum I'd asked. "My dear sir," I said, "you'd greatly oblige me if you'd come back here to pledge the ring on my behalf. Now that it has been offered once by you, it might look very strange if it were brought by another person. Of course, I'll pay all your expenses." The priest instantly agreed. I said I hoped he'd bring his niece with him. I was seated opposite to Christine during the dinner, and discovered fresh charms in her every minute. But, fearing I might lose her confidence if I tried to obtain some slight favour, I decided not to go to work too quickly. "My dear Christine," I said, Within a week I shall have arranged the affair. In the meantime, I'll write to you. I hope you have no objection to corresponding with me." "My uncle will write for me, for I have never been taught writing." "What?" I said. "You wish to become the wife of a Venetian, and you can't write? You must certainly do so, and before you come to Venice, for everybody would laugh at you if you couldn't write. I see that it makes you sad, my dear, but it can't be helped." "I undertake," said her uncle, "to teach you in a fortnight, if only you'll practice diligently." "It's a great undertaking," said Christine, "but I accept it. I promise you to work night and day, and to begin tomorrow." After dinner I advised the priest not to leave that evening, but to rest overnight. I observed that, by leaving before daybreak, he would reach his destination in good time and feel all the better for it. He was easily persuaded to remain. I ordered a carriage for the clergyman, and desired that a fire might be lit for me in the next room, where I'd sleep. But the good priest said that it was unnecessary, because there were 2 large beds in our room. One could be for me, and the other for him and his niece. "We needn't undress," he added, "as we mean to leave very early, but you can take off your clothes, sir, because you're not going with us, and you're likely to remain in bed tomorrow morning." "Oh," said Christine, "I must undress, otherwise I can't sleep. But I'll only need a few minutes to get ready in the morning." I said nothing, but I was amazed. Christine, then, lovely and charming enough to wreck the chastity of a Xenocrates, would sleep naked with her uncle. True, he was old, devout, and without any of the ideas which might render such a position dangerous. Yet the priest was a man. He'd evidently felt like all men, and he ought to have known the danger he was exposing himself to. My carnal-mindedness couldn't encompass a state of such innocence. But it was truly innocent. So much so that he did it openly. I didn't suppose that anyone could see anything wrong in it. I saw it all plainly, but I wasn't accustomed to such things. I went down to the kitchen to order our supper. When I returned, I found Christine caressing the cheeks of her old uncle, who was laughing. "Do you know what my niece is seeking?" he said. "She wants me to leave her here until my return. She tells me that you were like brother and sister during the hour you spent alone together this morning, and I believe it, but she doesn't consider that she'd be a great trouble to you." "Quite the reverse," I said. "She will afford me great pleasure, for I think her very charming. As to our mutual behaviour, I believe you can trust us both to do our duty." "I have no doubt of it. Well, I'll leave her under your care until the day after tomorrow. I'll come back early in the morning so as to attend to your business." Then he left us on some business of his own, saying that he'd return at nightfall. I remained alone with the charming, artless Christine, and lost no time in thanking her for the confidence she placed in me. "I wish you to have a thorough knowledge of me," she said, "so that you can be more thoroughly satisfied. And I promise to learn writing immediately." "You are charming and true," I said, "but you must be discreet and confide to no one that we have entered into an agreement with each other. You must act according to your uncle's instructions, for it is to him that I intend to write to make all arrangements." "You may rely upon my discretion. I will say nothing, not even to my mother, until you give me permission to do so." I passed the afternoon in denying myself even the slightest liberties with my lovely companion, but falling every minute deeper in love with her. By the time her uncle returned, I'd quite decided to make her my wife. We had a delicious supper. I had to teach Christine how to eat oysters and truffles, which she then saw for the first time. We went to bed before midnight, and it was broad daylight when I awoke. The curate had left the room so quietly that I hadn't heard him. I looked towards the other bed. Christine was asleep. As I wished her good morning, she opened her eyes, and leaning on her elbow, she smiled sweetly. "Dearest Christine, you're as lovely as one of God's angels. I have a great longing to give you a kiss." "If you long for a kiss, my dear friend, come and give me one." I jump out of bed. Decency makes her hide her face. It was cold, and I was in love. I find myself in her arms by one of those spontaneous movements which sentiment alone can cause, and we belong to each other without having thought of it. She happy and rather confused, I delighted, yet unable to realize the truth of a victory won without any contest. An hour passed in the midst of happiness, during which we forgot the whole world. Calm followed the stormy gusts of passionate love, and we gazed at each other without speaking. Christine was the first to break the silence. "What have we done?" she asked. "We have become husband and wife." "What will my uncle say tomorrow?" "He needn't know anything about it until he gives us the nuptial benediction in his own church." "And when will he do so?" "As soon as he has completed all the arrangements necessary for a public marriage." "How long will that be?" "About a month." "You aren't deceiving me?" "No, for I adore you." The morning passed off quickly, but towards dinner-time I thought that Christine looked different from how she'd seemed the day before, and I asked her the reason for the change. "It must be," she said, "the same reason which causes you to be thoughtful." I didn't tell her all my reasons for being pensive. I'd found myself drawn into an engagement which wasn't disagreeable to me, but I wished it hadn't been so very quick. I couldn't conceal from myself that repentance was beginning to creep into my amorous and well-disposed mind, and I was grieved at it. We had the whole evening before us, and as she told me that she'd never gone to a theatre, we went there, and after the performance I took her to the casino. Her astonishment made me laugh when she saw a faro bank for the first time. I gave her 10 sequins and explained what she had to do. She didn't even know the cards, yet in less than an hour she'd won 100. I made her leave off playing, and we returned to the inn. We had a light supper, and spent a delightful night, taking good care to part by daybreak, so as not to be caught in the same bed by the worthy ecclesiastic. He arrived early and found us sleeping soundly in our respective beds. He woke me, and I gave him the ring which he went to pledge immediately. When he returned 2 hours later, he saw us dressed and talking quietly near the fire. The time had come to part. I promised to pay them a visit in the first days of Lent, but on the condition that on my arrival I wouldn't find anyone informed of my name or my business. The curate gave me the birth certificate of his niece, and the account of her possessions. As soon as they'd gone, I departed for Venice, full of love for the charming girl, and determined on keeping my engagement with her. My return caused the greatest joy to my 3 excellent friends. Not accustomed to having me absent for 3 days, Messieurs Dandolo and Barbaro had been afraid that some accident had befallen me. But Monsieur de Bragadine's faith was stronger, and he'd allayed their fears. The very next day I resolved to ensure Christine's happiness without making her my wife. I'd thought of marrying her when I loved her better than myself, but after obtaining possession, my self-love proved stronger than my love for Christine. I couldn't make up my mind to renounce the advantages attached to my happy independence. Yet I was the slave of sentiment. To abandon the artless, innocent girl seemed to me an awful crime, and the mere idea of it made me shudder. I was aware that she was, perhaps, bearing in her womb a living token of our mutual love. and I shivered at the bare possibility that her confidence in me might be repaid by shame and everlasting misery. I thought of finding her a husband in every way better than myself. A husband so good that she'd not only forgive me for the insult, but also thank me at the end, and like me all the better for my deceit. To find such a husband couldn't be very difficult, for Christine was blessed not only with wonderful beauty and a well-established reputation for virtue, but she was also the possessor of a fortune amounting to 4,000 Venetian ducats. I sought Monsieur de Bragadine's help. Aware of his superstitious turn of mind, I gave my request the air of a revelation from on high. "You must," I said to him, "obtain from the Holy Father a dispensation for a worthy and virtuous girl, so as to give her the privilege of marrying during Lent in the church of her village. Here's her birth certificate. The husband isn't yet known, but that doesn't matter. A husband will be found." "Trust me," said my father. "I'll write at once to our ambassador in Rome. You needn't be anxious. Leave it all to me. I'll make it a matter of state." I informed my friends that I'd consulted the oracle to ascertain who'd be the girl's husband, and the answer was that Monsieur Dandelot was entrusted with the care of finding one. Young, handsome, virtuous, and able to serve the Republic either at home or abroad. Monsieur Dandelot was to consult me before concluding any arrangements. I gave him courage for his task by informing him that the girl had a dowry of 4,000 ducats, but I added that his choice was to be made within a fortnight. Monsieur de Bragadin, delighted at not being entrusted with the commission, laughed heartily. Those arrangements made me feel at peace with myself. I was certain that a husband I wanted would be found. 10 days later, the license for marriage arrived from Rome. The dispensation gave Christine the right of being married in any church in Christendom. No publication of banns was required. We needed, therefore, but one trifling thing: the husband. Fortune was smiling on me, however, and had rendered me the possessor of 1,000 sequins. I paid all my debts, and now had to take the diamond ring out of the pledge. Not wishing to do it myself, I wrote to the priest making an appointment in Treviso. I was not, of course, surprised when I found that he was accompanied by his lovely niece. Thinking that I'd come to complete all arrangements for our marriage, she embraced me without ceremony, and I did the same. If the uncle hadn't been present, I'm afraid that those kisses would have caused all my heroism to vanish. I gave the curate the dispensation from Rome, and Christine's lovely face shone with joy. As I wasn't yet certain of anything, I didn't undeceive her then. I promised to be in her hometown within 10 days, when we'd complete all necessary arrangements. After dinner, I gave the curate the ticket for the ring and the money to take it out of pledge, and we retired to rest. This time, very fortunately, there was but one bed in the room, and I had to take another chamber for myself. The next morning, her uncle went out for my diamond ring, and alone with that lovely girl, I spent an hour fighting like St. Anthony against the carnal desires of my nature. I could see the charming girl full of love and wonder at my reserve. We parted after my promising to come back again within 10 days, and I returned to Venice. On the second Sunday in Lent, Monsieur Dandelot told me with an air of triumph that the fortunate husband had been found, and that there was no doubt of my approval of the new candidate. He named someone I knew by sight, very handsome young man of 22, of irreproachable conduct. He was a godson of Count Algarotti, a sister of whom had married Monsieur Dandelot's brother. "Charles," said Monsieur Dandelot, "has lost his parents, and I'm sure his godfather will guarantee his wife's dowry. I've spoken to him, and I believe him disposed to marry." "Seems to promise well," I said, "but I can't decide until I've seen him." "I've invited him to dine with us tomorrow." The young man came, and I found him worthy of all Monsieur Dandelot's praise. We became friends at once. The following day Charles introduced me to his aunt, in whose house he lived with his sister, and I was much pleased with their friendly welcome. When I returned to the palace, I told Monsieur Dandolo that he might open the affair with Count Algarotti. Charles called on me to inquire when I'd be kind enough to introduce him to the girl. I named the day, adding that it was necessary to devote a whole day to the visit, as she resided at a distance of 20 miles from Venice. We'd dine with her and return the same evening. He promised to be ready for me by daybreak. I immediately sent an express to the curate to inform him of the day on which I'd call with a friend of mine whom I wished to introduce to his niece. On the appointed day, Charles was punctual. As we went, I took care to let him know that I'd made the acquaintance of the girl and her uncle as travelling companions from Venice to Mestre about 1 month before, and that I'd offered myself as a husband, if I'd been in a position to guarantee the dowry of 4,000 ducats. I didn't think it necessary to go any further in my confidences. We arrived at the good priest's house 2 hours before midday. Soon after our arrival, Christine came in, expressing all her pleasure at seeing me. She bowed to Charles and said that she'd take us to her mother. She was dressed like a simple country girl, yet very neatly, and she wore handsome gold chains round her neck and on her arms. I told her to take my arm and that of Charles, which she did. We went to her mother's house. The good woman was compelled to keep to her bed owing to sciatica. As we entered the room, a doctor rose at the sight of Charles and embraced him affectionately. After we had paid our compliments to the good woman, the doctor inquired after Charles's aunt and sister. Alluding to the sister who was suffering from a secret disease, Charles desired to say a few words to him in private. They left the room together. Being alone with the mother and Christine, I praised Charles, his excellent conduct, his high character, his business abilities, and extolled the happiness of the woman destined to be his wife. They confirmed my praise, saying that everything I said of him could be read on his features. I had no time to lose, so I told Christine to be on her guard during dinner, as Charles might possibly be the husband whom God had intended for her.
For me?
Yes, for you. Charles is one of 1,000. You would be much happier with him than you could be with me. The doctor knows him, and you could find out from him everything that I can't find time to tell you now about my friend. I leave you to imagine all I suffered in saying this, and my surprise when I saw that the girl remained calm and perfectly composed. After a short silence, she asked me whether I was certain that such a handsome young man would have her. That question gave me an insight into Christine's heart and feelings, and quieted all my sorrow, for I saw that I hadn't known her well. I answered that, beautiful as she was, there was no doubt of her being loved by everybody. It'll be at dinner, my dear Christine, that my friend will study you. Just show all the charms and qualities with which God has endowed you, but don't let him suspect our intimacy.
If your friend should feel pleased with me, when would he marry me?
Within 10 days. I'll take care of everything, and you'll see me again in the course of the week. Charles came back with the doctor, and Christine, leaving her mother's bedside, took a chair opposite to us. She answered very sensibly all the questions addressed to her by Charles, often exciting his mirth by her artlessness, but not showing any silliness. During dinner, I was delighted to see with what ease and interest she kept up the conversation. Afterwards, as we were taking our leave, I heard Charles say,
"Lovely Christine, you're made to minister to the happiness of a prince."
And Christine? This was her answer.
"I think myself fortunate, sir, if you should judge me worthy of ministering to yours."
These words excited Charles so much that he embraced me. During our journey back to Venice, Charles spoke of nothing but his happiness. He had decidedly fallen in love. "I'll call tomorrow morning upon Count Algarotti," he said to me, "and you may write to the priest to come with all the necessary documents to make the contract of marriage." His delight and surprise were intense when I told him that my wedding present to Christine was a dispensation from the Pope for her to be married in Lent. "Then," he exclaimed, "we must go full speed ahead." My 3 friends and I attended the wedding, as well as much of the nobility of Venice, curious about the circumstances and anxious to examine the bride. By her beauty and pleasing manners, Christine had won the affection of Charles's aunt, his sister, and his godfather, and Count Algarotti, who, acting as Charles's father, had taken upon himself all the expense of the wedding. We repaired to the church towards 11 o'clock, and were very much astonished at the difficulty we experienced in getting in. As they returned from the church, Charles and Christine knelt down before the young wife's mother, who gave them her blessing with tears of joy. Dinner was served, and of course Christine and her happy spouse took the seats of honor. Mine was the last, and I was very glad of it, but although everything was delicious, I ate very little. I was seated not very far from Count Algarotti, and I heard him say several times to Christine's godmother that he'd never felt so delighted in his life. When 4 o'clock struck, Charles whispered a few words to his lovely wife. She bowed to her godmother, and everybody rose from the table. After the usual compliments, the bride distributed packets of sugar plums among all the girls of the village, and she took leave of them, kissing them all without any pride. Then Christine left her village to follow her husband, and for the remainder of their lives they lived together in mutual happiness. In June, I went to the fair at Padua, and made the acquaintance of a young man of my own age, who was then studying mathematics under the celebrated Professor Succi. His name was Tognolo, but, thinking it didn't sound well, he changed it to Fabrice. This man, who owed his later high fortune to his talents, would perhaps have lived and died unknown if he'd kept his name of Tognolo, a truly vulgar one. The privileged class doesn't admit the responsibility of a peasant having talent or genius. The distinguished appearance, the noble sentiments, the great knowledge, and the talents of Fabrice would have been turned into ridicule in a man named Tognolo. Such is the force of prejudice. Towards the end of the autumn, my friend Fabrice introduced me to a family who resided in the country on the road to Zero. In this family, card-playing, love-making, and practical jokes were the order of the day. But the golden rule was never to get angry and to laugh at everything, for one was to take every jest pleasantly or to be thought a bore. Bedsteads would tumble down under their occupants. Ghosts were impersonated. Diuretic pills or sugar plums were given to young ladies, as well as sweetmeats which produced certain winds rising from the nether regions and impossible to keep under control. These jokes would sometimes go rather too far, but such was the spirit animating all the members of that circle that they'd laugh. I was as involved as the others in the war of offence and defence, but at last such a bitter joke was played on me that it suggested to me another, the fatal consequence of which put a stop to the mania by which we were all possessed. We were in the habit of walking to a farm which was about half a league distant by the road, but the distance could be reduced by half by going over a deep and muddy ditch across which a narrow plank was thrown. I always insisted on going that way, in spite of the fright of the ladies, who always trembled on that narrow bridge. I never failed to cross the first, and to offer my hand to help them over. One fine day I crossed first so as to give them courage, but suddenly, when I reached the middle of the plank, it gave way under me, and there I was, in the ditch, up to my chin in stinking mud. In spite of my inward rage, I was obliged, according to the general understanding, to join in the merry laughter of all my companions. But the merriment didn't last for long, for everyone declared the joke to be too bad. Some peasants were called to the rescue, and with much difficulty they dragged me out in the most awful state. Of course, I laughed more heartily than anybody else, although I had already made an inward vow to have the most cruel revenge. It was evident that the plank had been purposely sawn, and in order to know the author, I had only to appear calm and indifferent about it. I was taken back to the house. A shirt, a coat, a complete costume were lent me, for I'd come for only 24 hours and hadn't brought anything with me. I went to the city the next morning, and towards evening I returned to the merry company. Fabrice, who'd really been as angry as myself, remarked to me that the perpetrator of the joke evidently felt his guilt, because he took good care not to disclose himself. But I unveiled the mystery. I promised 1 sequin to a peasant woman if she could find out who'd sawn the plank. She managed to discover the young man in question. I called on him, and the offer of a sequin, together with my threats, compelled him to confess that he'd been paid for his work by Signor Demetrio, a Greek dealer in spices. He was an amiable man in his middle years, on whom I'd never played any trick, except in the case of a pretty young servant girl whom he was courting and whom I juggled from him. Satisfied with my discovery, I racked my brain to invent a good practical joke, but to obtain complete revenge, it was necessary that my trick should prove worse than the one he'd played on me. Armed with my hunting knife, I went alone to the cemetery a little after midnight, and opening the grave of a dead man who'd been buried that very day, I cut off one of the arms near the shoulder. After I'd reburied the corpse, I returned to my room with the arm. The next day, when supper was over, I left the table and retired to my chamber as if I intended to go to bed, but taking the arm with me, I hid myself under Demetrio's bed. A short time after, the Greek comes in, undresses himself, puts his light out, and lies down. I give him time to fall nearly asleep. Then, placing myself at the foot of the bed, I pull away the clothes, little by little, until he's half naked. He laughs and calls out, "Whoever you may be, go away and let me sleep quietly, for I don't believe any ghosts." Then he covers himself again and composes himself to sleep. I wait 5 or 6 minutes, and pull again at the bedclothes. He sits up so as to catch the hand which is pulling at the bedclothes, and I take care that he should get hold of the dead hand. Confident that he has caught the man or woman who is playing the trick, he pulls it towards him, laughing all the time. I keep tight hold of the arm for a few instants, and then I let it go suddenly. The Greek falls back on his pillow without uttering a single word. The trick was played. I leave the room without any noise, and reaching my chamber, go to bed. I was fast asleep when, towards morning, I was awakened by people moving about. Not understanding why they should be up so early, I got up. The first person I met, the mistress of the house, told me that I had played an abominable joke. I? What have I done? Monsieur Demetrio is dying. I dressed myself, rather frightened, I confess, but determined to plead complete ignorance of everything, and I proceeded to Demetrio's room. There I was confronted with horror-stricken countenances and bitter reproaches. I found all the guests around him. I protested my innocence, but everyone smiled. The archpriest and the beadle, who'd just arrived, wouldn't bury the arm which was lying there, and they told me that I'd been guilty of a great crime. "I am astonished, reverend sir," I said, "at the hasty judgment passed on me when there's no proof." "You alone are capable of such an abomination," said all the guests. "It's just like you. No one but you would have dared to do such a thing." "I am compelled," said the archpriest, "to draw up an official report." "As you please," I said. "I haven't the slightest objection. I have nothing to fear." And I left the room. I continued to take it coolly, and at the dinner table I was informed that Monsieur Demetrio had recovered the use of his eyes. The next day he could speak, but I heard, after I'd taken leave of the family, that he was stupid and spasmodic. The poor man remained in that painful state for the rest of his life. I felt deeply grieved, but I hadn't intended to injure him so badly. I thought that the trick he had played on me might have cost me my life, but I couldn't help deriving consolation from that idea. On the same day, the archpriest made up his mind to have the arm buried and to send a formal denunciation against me to the episcopal chancellorship of Treviso. Annoyed at the reproaches which I received on all sides, I returned to Venice, realizing I must once more move on. 2 days later, I reached Mantua. I was alone, with plenty of clothes and jewelry, without letters of introduction, but with a well-filled purse. Unfortunately, I lived like an anchorite during the first 2 months of my stay in Mantua, owing to the folly that I committed on the night of my arrival. My slight erotic inconvenience, by compelling me to follow the diet necessary to cure me, most likely saved me from greater misfortunes, which, perhaps, I shouldn't have been able to avoid. Immediately after Easter, the opera opened. As I was entirely cured by then, I had resumed my normal life and was present at every performance. Belletti, the opera manager, was in the habit of breakfasting with me almost every morning. But I did not care for Mantua, and as my purse was well filled, I resolved on going to Naples to see again my dear Therese, Donna Lucrezia, and all my former acquaintances. However, my good genius didn't approve of that decision, for I was prevented from carrying it out. This is how it happened. Returning to my inn, mine host handed me a playbill announcing 4 performances of the Didoni of Metastasio at the Spada. Seeing no acquaintances of mine among the actors or actresses, I made up my mind to go to the play in the evening and to start early the next day with post-horses. Before entering the theatre, I went into the actress's dressing-room, and the leading lady struck me as rather good-looking. Her name was Narisi, and she was from Bologna. I bowed to her, and after the commonplace conversation usual in such cases, I said, "Do you have any lover?" "No," she replied. "Then I offer myself for the post, if you have no objection." She jeered at me. "Will you take 4 tickets for the 4 performances?" I took 2 sequins out of my purse, taking care to let her see that it was well filled, and when she gave me the 4 tickets, I left the room without uttering a single word. She called me back. I pretended not to hear, and took a ticket for the pit. I found the whole performance very poor. I was thinking of going away when, happening to look towards the royal box, I saw, to my astonishment, that it was tenanted by the Venetian Manzoni and the celebrated Juliet, who I'd met in 1741. Recalling that our acquaintance had been somewhat sharp, I inquired from the person seated next to me who that beautiful woman wearing so many diamonds was. He told me that she was Madame Querini from Venice. General Count Spada, the owner of the theatre, who was sitting near her, had brought her with him from Faenza. I was glad to hear that Monsieur Querini had married her, but I didn't think of renewing the acquaintance, and was on the point of going away when she happened to see me and called me. I went up to her, and, not wishing to be known by anyone, I whispered to her that my name was Farusi. Manzoni, who had yet to acknowledge me, informed me that I was speaking to Her Excellency, Madame Querini. "I know it," I said, "through a letter which I've received from Venice, and I beg to offer my most sincere congratulations to Madame." She heard me, and introduced me to General Count Spada, creating me a baron on the spot. He invited me most kindly to come to his box, asked me where I'd come from, where I was going to, and begged the pleasure of my company at supper for the same evening. I enlivened the supper by my stories and witty jests, and captivated everybody's friendship, particularly that of General Spada. When he heard me say that I was going to Naples only to gratify an amorous fancy, he begged me to spend a month with him and to sacrifice my whim. But I longed to see Lucrezia and Therese, whose charms after 5 years I could scarcely recollect. So I consented to remain in Cesena for only the 4 days during which the General intended to stay. The next morning, as I was dressing, there was a knock at my door. My visitor proved to be the first castrato of the theatre, who brought an invitation to dinner from Narisi. I accepted it with a smile. The castrato was named Nicholas Peritti. He claimed to be the grandson of a natural child of Pope Sixtus V. It might have been so. There was a numerous attendance in Narisi's rooms, especially of young men, who after dinner lost all their money. I didn't play, and it was a disappointment for my pretty hostess, who had invited me only because she judged me as simple as the others. The next day, before supper, I broke the bank, and after supper, feeling tired and well pleased with what I'd won, I returned to the inn. The following day, the last but one of my stay in Cesena, I said at dinner to the guests, "Tonight I'll take the bank." In the evening, after the performance, I took the bank according to my promise. I lost a few sequins, but was comforted by everybody, and that's much more pleasant than winning, provided we're not under the hard necessity of making money. The next morning I was awakened by a terrible noise in the passage, almost at the door of my room. Getting out of bed, I opened my door to ascertain the cause of the uproar. I see a troop of sbirri at the door of a room, and in that room, sitting up in bed, a fine-looking man who was screaming in Latin. He was cursing the rabble, the plague of Italy, and the innkeeper who'd been rascally enough to open the door. I inquire of the innkeeper what it all means. "Oh, this gentleman," answered the scoundrel, "who it appears can only speak Latin, is in bed with a girl, and the sbirri of the bishop have been sent to find out whether she's truly his wife. All perfectly regular. If she is his wife, he has only to convince them by showing a certificate of marriage. But if she isn't, of course he must go to prison with her. Yet it needn't happen, for I undertake to arrange everything in a friendly manner for a few sequins. I have only to exchange a few words with the chief of the sbirri, and they all go away. If you can speak Latin, you better go in. Make him listen to reason." I enter the room and inform the gentleman of the cause of the disturbance. He laughs and replies that in the first place it was impossible to say whether the person in bed with him was a woman, for that person had been seen only in the costume of a military officer. In the second place, he didn't think any human being had a right to compel him to say whether his bedfellow was his wife or his mistress, even supposing that his companion was indeed a woman. "At all events," he added, "I'm determined not to give 1 crown to settle the affair, and to remain in bed until my door is shut. The moment I'm dressed, I'll treat you to an amusing denouement of this comedy. I'll drive all those scoundrels away at the point of my sword." I then see in the corner a broad sword, and a Hungarian costume, looking like a military uniform. I ask whether he's an officer. "I have written my name and profession," he answers, "in the hotel book." I ask him to entrust his passport to me for a few minutes. "I have 2, he says, "so I can let you have one." And taking the document out of his pocketbook, he hands it to me. The passport was signed by Cardinal Albani. The officer was a captain in a Hungarian regiment belonging to the Empress. He was from Rome, on his way to Parma, with dispatches from Cardinal Albani. At that moment, a man burst into the room, speaking very loudly, and asked me to tell the officer that the affair must be settled at once, because he wanted to leave Cesena immediately. "Who are you?" I asked. He replied that he was the vetturino whom the captain had engaged. I saw that it was a regular put-up thing, and I begged the captain to let me attend to the business, assuring him that I would settle it to his honour and advantage. "Do exactly as you please," he said. Turning towards the vetturino, I ordered him to bring up the captain's luggage, saying that he'd be paid at once. When he'd done so, I handed him 8 sequins out of my own purse and made him give me a receipt in the name of the captain. The vetturino went away, and all but 2 of the sbirri followed him. "Captain," I said, "keep to your bed until I return. I'm now going to the bishop to give him an account of these proceedings and make him understand that he owes you some reparation." I hurried over my toilet and proceeded to the bishop's palace. There, making a great deal of noise, I almost compelled the servants to take me to his room. A lackey, who was at the door, informed me that his lordship was still in bed. "Never mind, I can't wait." I pushed him aside and entered the room. I related the whole affair to the bishop, exaggerating the uproar, making much of the injustice of such proceedings, and railing at a vexatious police daring to molest travellers and to insult the sacred rights of individuals and nations. The bishop told me to apply to the captain of the sbirri. "I shall go to somebody else," I said, and proceeded straight to the house of General Spada. But being told that he couldn't be seen before 8 o'clock, I returned to the inn. The ardour with which I'd made the affair mine might have led anyone to suppose that my indignation had been roused only by disgust at seeing an odious persecution perpetrated upon a stranger by an unrestrained, immoral, and vexatious police. But my ardour was excited by feelings of a more personal nature. I fancied that the woman concealed under the bedclothes was a beauty. I longed to see her, and the good opinion that I had of myself didn't leave the shadow of a doubt in my mind that she'd prefer me to her captain. The door of the room was still open, so I went in and related to the captain all I'd done, assuring him that in the course of the day he'd be at liberty to continue his journey at the bishop's expense, for the general wouldn't fail to obtain complete satisfaction for him. He thanked me warmly, gave back the 8 ducats I had paid for him, and said he wouldn't leave the city till the next day. "From what country," I asked him, "is your travelling companion?" "From France, and he speaks only his native language." "Then you speak French?" "Not one word." "That's odd. Then you converse in mime?" "Exactly." "I pity you, for it's a difficult language." "Yes, to express the various shades of thought. But in that part of our intercourse that matters, we understand each other quite well. May I invite myself to breakfast with you?" "Ask my friend whether he has any objection." "Amiable companion of the captain," I said in French, "will you kindly accept me as a 3rd guest at the breakfast table?" At these words I saw coming out of the bedclothes a lovely head with dishevelled hair and an open, laughing face. Although it was crowned with a man's cap, there was no doubt that the captain's friend belonged to that sex without which man would be the most miserable animal on earth. Delighted with the graceful creature, I told her that now I had the pleasure of seeing her, I was eternally at her service. She answered me with the grace and the animation which are the exclusive privilege of her native country. I was already a slave to her charms when I went out to order breakfast. When I returned with the waiter, I found my lovely Frenchwoman wearing a blue frock-coat, her hair badly arranged like a man's, but very charming even in that strange costume. Immediately after breakfast, I called on the general and related the affair to him, enlarging upon it in such a manner as to pique his martial pride. I told him that unless he settled the matter himself, the Hungarian captain was determined to send an express to the cardinal immediately. But my eloquence was unnecessary, for the general liked to see priests attend to the business of heaven, but he could not bear them to meddle in temporal affairs. "Well, I shall immediately put a stop to this ridiculous comedy," he said. He turned to his aide-de-camp. "Go at once to the inn and invite that officer and his companion to dine with me today. Then go to the bishop's palace and give him notice that the officer who has been so grossly insulted by his sbirri shall not leave the city before he has received a complete apology and whatever sum of money he may claim as damages." When the time came for dinner, I found my friends ready in their military costumes. The Frenchwoman's uniform was, of course, a fancy one, but very elegant. The moment I saw her, captivated by her beauty, I gave up all ideas of Naples, and decided to accompany my new friends to Parma. The captain was certainly nearly 60. I imagined that the affair which I was already concocting in my brain could be arranged amicably. The adjutant came back with the priest sent by the bishop. Damages were paid. Thus the matter ended. A little before dinner-time we repaired to General Spada's mansion, and the general presented the two officers to all the ladies. Not one of them was deceived in the young officer, but, being already acquainted with the adventure, they were all delighted to dine with the hero of the comedy and treat the handsome officer exactly as if he were truly a man. It was Madame Querini alone who didn't seem pleased, because the lovely stranger monopolized the general attention, and it was a blow to her vanity to see herself neglected. She never spoke to her, except to show off her French, which she could speak well. The poor captain scarcely opened his lips, for no one cared to speak Latin, and the general hadn't much to say in German. But after a while the conversation became animated, and the young female officer was entertaining everybody, even Madame Querini Juliet, though she remained spiteful. "Seems strange," she remarked, "that you and the captain should live together without ever speaking to each other." "Why, madame? We understand one another perfectly. Speech is of very little consequence in the kind of business we do together." Everybody laughed, except Madame Querini Juliet. The conversation continued in the same amusing style, and all the guests were delighted with the graceful wit of the charming officer. Late in the evening I took leave of the general and wished him a pleasant journey. "Adieu," he said. "I wish you a pleasant journey to Naples, and hope you'll enjoy yourself there." "Well, General, I'm not going to Naples immediately. I've changed my mind and intend to proceed to Parma. I also wish to constitute myself the interpreter of these two officers who know nothing of Italian." "Ah, young man, opportunity creates a thief, does it not? Well, if I were in your place, I'd do the same." I also bade farewell to Madame Querini, who asked me to write to her from Bologna. I gave her a promise to do so, but without meaning to fulfill it. Now I turned my attention to winning the love of the beautiful Frenchwoman. After all, I argued, who could prefer a 60-year-old Hungarian against my 23 years? Moreover, I reasoned, my company would certainly be agreeable to them, as they couldn't exchange a single word by themselves. With this idea, I asked the captain as we reached our inn how he intended to proceed to Parma. "As I have no carriage of my own," he answered, "we shall have to take the coach." "Well, I have a very comfortable carriage," I said, "and I offer you two the back seats if you have no objection to my society." "That's a piece of good fortune. Be kind enough to propose it to Henriette." I turned to her. "Will you, madame, grant me the favour of accompanying you to Parma?" "I should be delighted. But take care, sir. Your task won't be an easy one. You'll often find yourself obliged to translate for both of us." I left them in order to find a carriage that I could purchase, for the one I had boasted of existed only in my imagination. As good luck would have it, I found just what I wanted. At supper the conversation was almost entirely a dialogue between Henriette and myself. At first I couldn't suppose her to be anything but an adventuress,
but I was astonished at discovering in her those noble and delicate feelings which denote a good education. However, as such an idea would not have suited the views I had about her, I rejected it whenever it presented itself to my mind. Whenever I tried to make her talk about the captain, she changed the subject. Yet she didn't elude this question. "At least tell me, madam, whether the captain is your husband or your father." She smiled. "Neither one nor the other." That was enough for me. And in reality, what more did I want to know? The worthy captain had fallen asleep. When he awoke, I wished them both good night and retired to my room with a heart full of love and a mind full of projects. I felt certain of success, for I was young. I enjoyed excellent health, I had money, and plenty of daring. I liked the affair all the better because it must come to a conclusion in a few days. The honest Hungarian insisted on giving me in advance the amount to be paid for the post-horses at the different stages as far as Parma, and so we left Cesena, but not without a contest of politeness respecting the seats. The captain wanted me to occupy the back seat next to Henriette, but I'm sure you understand how much better the seat opposite to her suited me. So I insisted on taking the bracket seat, and had the double advantage of showing my politeness and of having constantly, and without difficulty before my eyes, the lovely woman whom I adored. After a while, some fault developed with the carriage, and we stopped at Forli to have it repaired. After a very cheerful supper, I retired to my room, thinking of nothing but the charming woman by whom I was so completely captivated. Along the road, Henriette had struck me as so exotic that I couldn't sleep in the second bed in their room. I was afraid that she'd leave her old comrade to come to my bed, and I didn't know how far the worthy captain would have put up with such a situation. Of course, I wanted to possess that lovely creature, but I wanted everything to be settled amicably. Henriette had nothing but the military costume in which she stood, not any women's linen, not even one chemise. For a change, she took the captain's shirt. Such a state of things was so new to me that the situation seemed a complete enigma. In Bologna, excited by an excellent supper and by the amorous passion which was every hour burning more fiercely in me, I asked her how she'd become the friend of the honest fellow who looked more like her father than her lover. She smiled. "If you wish to know, ask him to tell you the whole story himself." Of course, I applied at once to the captain, and having first ascertained by signs that the charming Frenchwoman had no objection, the good man told me how he'd encountered her in Civita Vecchia, close to Rome, dressed in uniform, in the company of an elderly officer. By chance, his lodgings overlooked the inn where they lodged, and he saw them whenever he opened his window. In the evening he saw the couple taking supper, but he noticed that they never exchanged a word. He was so intrigued that when he saw her alone in the room, he sent a message requesting an hour's conversation in exchange for 10 sequins. His servant returned to say that her answer, given in French, was that she was leaving for Rome immediately after breakfast, and that once in that city, he'd easily find some opportunity of speaking to her. "On my return to Rome," said the captain, "I was much taken up with matters of business and had almost forgotten the handsome adventuress. Then, 2 days before my departure, my cicerone told me he discovered where she lived, and that she was with the same officer. I told him to try to see her, and to let her know that my departure was fixed for the following day. We arranged to meet, and we have remained together ever since. We dined together, and you can imagine what difficulty we had in understanding one another, but we managed by mime, and after the dessert we comprehended each other very well. I fancied that I'd seen the end of it, and you may imagine how surprised I was when, upon my offering her the 10 sequins, she refused, most positively, to take any money, making me understand that she would rather go with me to Parma, because she had some business in that city. The proposal was rather agreeable to me, so I agreed. I was only sorry that, with our mutual ignorance of the language spoken by each of us, we had no opportunity of conversation, for I should have been greatly pleased to hear her adventures, which I think must be interesting. You can, of course, guess that I have no idea who she is. I only know that she calls herself Henriette, that she must be a Frenchwoman, and that she's as gentle as a turtle dove. Well, she has evidently received a good education. She enjoys good health. She's witty and courageous, as we've both seen. I hope she'll relate her adventures to you so that I may know her story. I'm sincerely her friend, and I can assure you that it'll grieve me to part from her in Parma. Please tell her that when we reach Parma, I'll give her the money paid to me by the bishop. If I were rich, I'd give her more substantial proofs of my tender affection. Now, sir, please, explain all this to her." I told her literally what the captain had related to me. In response, Henriette confirmed the truth of her friend's narrative, but she begged me to tell him that she could not grant his wish respecting the adventures of her life. "Be good enough to inform him," she added, "that the same principle which forbids me to utter a falsehood does not allow me to tell the truth. As for the money which he intends to give me, I won't accept it. And he'd deeply grieve me by pressing it upon me. The moment we reach Parma, I wish him to allow me to lodge wherever I may please and to make no inquiries whatever about me. If by chance he should happen to meet me, I beg him to appear not ever to have known me." As she spoke these words, she kissed her elderly friend in the manner which indicated esteem and gratitude rather than love. The captain, who didn't know why she was kissing him, was deeply grieved when I translated what Henriette had said. He begged me to tell her that if he was to obey her with any easy conscience, he must know whether she'd have everything she required in Parma. "You can assure him that he have no need for anxiety about me." This conversation made us all very sad. For a long time we remained thoughtful and silent. Finally, feeling the situation to be painful, I rose and wished them good night. As soon as I found myself alone in my room, deeply moved by conflicting feelings of love, surprise, and uncertainty, I began to give vent to my feelings in a kind of soliloquy, as I always do when I am strongly excited by anything. "Who can she be?" I said, speaking to the walls. "This girl who seems to have the most elevated feelings, but cloaks them under the veil of the most cynical debauchery. She says that in Parma she wishes to remain perfectly unknown, her own mistress, and I'm sure she'll place me under the same restrictions as the captain. Goodbye to my expectations. But who is she? What is she? She must either have a lover or a husband in Parma, or she must belong to a respectable family. Or perhaps, thanks to a boundless love for debauchery and confidence in her own charms, she intends to try and enslave some wealthy nobleman. But that would be the plan of someone reduced to utter despair, and this doesn't seem to be the case with Henriette. Yet she possesses nothing. True, but she refused the captain's help as if she had everything she needed. She might possibly feel herself justified in her conduct towards the captain, but it isn't the same with me. With her intelligence, she must be aware that I wouldn't have travelled with them if I hadn't been captivated by her. She must know she can't prevent me from wishing the reward which every man expects at the hands of the woman he loves. If she wants to make a dupe of me, I'm in honour bound to show her how mistaken she is. I'll ask her, I said to myself, to grant me the same favours which she has so easily granted her old captain. I felt sure that she couldn't refuse me some mark of real or pretended affection, so with my mind fully made up, I fell asleep. My thoughts were too completely absorbed by Henriette for her not to haunt my dreams, but the dream which I had throughout the night was so much like reality that on waking I looked for her in my bed. I found that the happy dream of the night had turned my love for the beautiful creature into a perfect amorous frenzy. My appetite, much more lively than on the previous day, didn't give me a minute's rest. I felt I had to satisfy it, or die of sheer hunger. I dressed, resolved on possessing the woman who'd inflamed all my senses even before resuming our journey. If I don't succeed, I said to myself, I won't go one step further. But in order not to offend against propriety, and not to deserve the reproaches of an honest man, I felt that it was my duty to have an explanation with the captain in the first place. I went to the room occupied by my 2 travelling companions. Finding the captain alone, I asked him whether he'd object to my trying to obtain Henriette as my mistress.
Let me have half an hour's conversation with her. If she refuses me, I remain here. You may go with her to Parma.
As soon as breakfast is over, said the excellent man, I'll go out and leave you alone with Henriette. I hope you succeed, for I'd be delighted to see her under your protection when I part with her. The captain went out immediately after breakfast. The moment he'd gone, I told Henriette that her friend had left us alone purposely, so as to give me the opportunity of a private interview with her. I told her that it was impossible for me to abandon her in a large city without any money or a roof over her head. That's not only impossible for me, but even if I go to Parma, you couldn't possibly be left on your own, because I love you so passionately that you must promise to be mine. Otherwise, I'll stay here. In that case, you must go to Parma alone with the captain, for I feel that if I accompanied you any further, I should soon be the most wretched of men. I couldn't bear to see you with another lover, with a husband, not even in the midst of your family. In fact, I'd wish to see you and live with you forever. Let me tell you, lovely Henriette, that if it's possible for a Frenchman to forget, an Italian cannot, at least to judge from my own feelings. I've made up my mind. You must be good enough to decide now, and to tell me whether I'm to accompany you or remain here. Answer yes or no. Now be kind enough to decide before the captain returns. He knows all about this, for I've told him what I feel. And what did he answer? That he'd be happy to see you under my protection. But what is the meaning of that smile playing on your lips? Pray, allow me to laugh, for I've never in my life seen such a furious declaration of love. Madam, make your choice, either one way or the other, and decide instantly. And she burst out laughing. Yes, I said, it's neither gentle nor gallant, but it is passionate. Remember that this is a serious matter, and that I've never before found myself so much pressed by time. Can you, on your side, realize the painful position of a man who, being deeply in love, finds himself compelled to take a decision which could mean the difference between life and death? My beloved Henriette, despite the passion raging in me, I'm not failing in the respect I owe you. For if you persist in your strange request to be abandoned alone and friendless in Parma, the course of action that I have decided to take isn't a threat. It would require the most heroic effort on my part not to come with you, an effort which ought to call for your esteem. I told you that time is of the essence. Please consider how very little time there is for both of us to make our decisions. The word choose mustn't sound harshly in your ears, since it leaves my fate as well as yours entirely in your hands. To feel certain of my love, do you want to see me kneeling before you like an idiot, crying and entreating you to take pity on me? No, madam. That would certainly displease you, and it wouldn't help me. I am conscious of being worthy of your love. I therefore ask for that feeling and not for pity. Leave me if I displease you, I said, but then let me go away. If I were to follow you to Parma, I couldn't answer for myself, for I might give way to my despair. Now consider everything well. I beg you. You would indeed be guilty of great cruelty if you were to answer now. Come to Parma, although I must beg of you not to see me in that city. Confess that you cannot, in all fairness, give me such an answer. Am I not right? Certainly, she said, if you truly loved me. Good God, I cried, if I love you? Oh,
Yes! Believe me, my love is immense, sincere. Now decide my fate. But are you aware that you look very angry? No, not angry. I'm only in a state of uncontrollable excitement in one of the decisive hours of my life, a prey to the most fearful anxiety. I ought to curse my whimsical destiny and the Spiri of Cesena, for without them I should never have known you. Are you then, she said, so very sorry to have made my acquaintance? Have I not some reason to be? She looked at me quizzically. No, for I haven't given you my decision yet. Now I breathe more freely, I cried. For now I'm sure you'll tell me to accompany you to Parma. Yes, said Henriette. Come to Parma. End of CD 4.